I remember the exact moment I realized something wasn't adding up. For weeks, the headlines kept repeating the same story. America is winning, Iran is collapsing. But then suddenly, everything went silent. No victory speech, no clear outcome, just confusion. That's when I started asking myself a dangerous question. Did the most powerful country in the world just fail without admitting it? I've been following global conflicts for years, but this one felt different from day one. At first it looked predictable. The United States, with unmatched air power, advanced weapons, and global influence, going up against Iran. On paper it didn't even look like a fair fight, and honestly I believed the same thing most people did. I thought this would be over quickly, but then something strange started happening. Iran didn't collapse. It didn't beg for peace. It didn't even show signs of breaking. Instead, it absorbed the pressure. And that's when I realized maybe this war was never about winning in the traditional sense. Maybe it was about not losing. Because from what I was seeing, Iran wasn't trying to dominate, it was trying to survive. And in modern warfare, survival itself can be a strategy. While everyone was focused on explosions, airstrikes, and military power, Iran was playing a completely different game. A slower game, a smarter game. They avoided direct confrontation. They relied on asymmetric tactics. They made it difficult for a stronger enemy to land a decisive blow. And day by day the narrative started shifting. Not loudly, not officially, but quietly in the background. The question was no longer how fast will Iran lose? It became, why hasn't Iran lost yet? And trust me, that question changes everything. I'll be honest, this is where things started to feel uncomfortable. Because the more I looked into it, the more it became clear the expectations were completely wrong. I remember analysts confidently saying Iran wouldn't last more than a few days. Some even predicted internal collapse, protests, maybe even regime change. But none of that happened. Instead, Iran held its ground. And that's when I started digging deeper into why. What I found changed my entire perspective. You see, most people think wars are won with technology, jets, missiles, air superiority. But that's only part of the story. Real wars are about scale. Let me explain it the way I understood it. In past conflicts, like Iraq, the United States didn't rely on air power alone. They deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, massive ground forces, long-term operations, complete control strategies. Now compare that to Iran, a country far larger, more complex terrain, mountains, cities, natural defenses, and a population in the tens of millions. So I asked myself, how do you control something that big without actually being there? And the answer was simple. You can't. Airstrikes can weaken a country, but they can't take control of it. They can't break a system that's built to endure. And that's exactly what Iran seemed prepared for. Every strike they absorbed, every pressure they resisted, it wasn't just defense. It was a message that said we are still here. And slowly that message started echoing across the world. Because now, this wasn't just about Iran anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about whether overwhelming power is still enough to control the outcome. And for the first time, it didn't look like it was. This is the part where everything quietly shifted. But almost no one talked about it openly. Because on the surface, it still looked like the same story. Airstrikes, pressure, strong statements. But underneath that, the reality was changing. I started noticing something very unusual. There was no major political collapse inside Iran. No sudden surrender, no signs that the system was breaking apart. And in conflicts like this, that silence speaks louder than anything else. Because if a strategy is working, you see results quickly. But here, weeks passed, and nothing decisive happened. That's when it hit me. Maybe the real failure wasn't visible on the battlefield. Maybe it was hidden in the expectations. You see, the original assumption was simple. Overwhelm Iran fast, force a deal, or trigger internal collapse. But none of those boxes were checked. Instead, Iran maintained its position. Its leadership stayed intact. Its core systems continued functioning. And most importantly, it didn't give up the things that mattered to it. No major concessions, no complete rollback, no clear defeat. And that's when I realized something that completely flipped the script in my mind. If one side is supposed to fall, and it doesn't, then who is actually losing? Because wars aren't just about destruction, they are about outcomes. And if the outcome you plan never happens, then every passing day becomes a problem. That's when the pressure starts shifting. Not on the battlefield, but on decision makers. And suddenly the question changes again. It's no longer about how to win, it becomes how do you get out. And once a war reaches that stage, everything becomes unpredictable. This is where things got very real, because once I started looking at it from that angle, everything began to make sense. The statements, the mixed signals, the sudden talk of deals and agreements. And Evenix, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like hesitation. I remember thinking, if everything is going according to plan, why rush toward a ceasefire? Why start talking about agreements when the objective hasn't clearly been achieved? That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about finding a way out. And history has shown this pattern again and again. When a conflict becomes too costly, too complicated, too unpredictable, leaders don't announce defeat. They look for an exit that doesn't look like one, a pause, a negotiation, a strategic agreement. Call it whatever you want. But at its core, it's a way to step back. Because the reality on the ground wasn't matching the original expectations. You can't control a massive country with limited presence. You can't force outcomes just with pressure from above. And you definitely can't reshape a region overnight. And the longer it dragged on, the clearer it became. This wasn't a quick operation. It was turning into something far more complex, something that could spiral. And when that risk appears, even the strongest powers start recalculating, not publicly, not directly, but through actions, through tone, through silence. And that's exactly what I was seeing. A shift. A quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a battle that could be won the way it was planned. At this point, I wasn't just watching a conflict anymore. I was watching a shift. Not loud, not officially announced, but undeniable. Because something bigger was happening behind the scenes. For years, the global system felt predictable. One dominant power, setting the rules, shaping outcomes, influencing regions far beyond its borders. And most countries, they adjusted to that reality. But now, I started noticing a different pattern. Other nations weren't reacting with fear. They were watching, calculating, and in some cases quietly pushing back. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about one war. This was about the balance of power itself. Because if a major power applies pressure and doesn't achieve a clear outcome, it sends a message. Not just to its opponent, but to the entire world. A message that says, maybe the system isn't as one-sided as we thought. And suddenly the idea of a single dominant force starts fading. In its place, something more complicated begins to emerge. Multiple centers of power, regional influence growing stronger, countries acting more independently, not because they suddenly became stronger overnight, but because they realized something important. Resistance is possible. And once that idea spreads, it changes everything. Trade decisions, alliances, military strategies, even confidence. Because power isn't just about strength, it's about perception. And perception was shifting. I could feel it. The world wasn't entering chaos. It was entering something new, something less predictable, something more balanced. And maybe,